Hello and welcome to this latest video from me, Mr. Boff. This is going to be a video focused on perhaps an element of Jekyll and Hyde that's sometimes ignored or passed over, and that's really a couple of key ideas. The first is the idea of night walking, and I'll explain shortly exactly what I mean by that. It's something slightly more interesting than just walking around at night. And then we've got that interesting looking French word, flâneur. So we'll look at exactly what that is, how that relates to walking around at night, and also the question of the flâneur and the criminal, and how those two different roles or identities even many times coexist within this novel. Obviously a novel notable for its duality. So we're going to be looking at Jekyll and Hyde in a different way, in a way that perhaps you've not thought about previously. And the benefit is it's going to enrich your analysis and understanding of the book more generally. So here's what we're going to be covering today. We're going to be looking at what we mean by night walking as a very specific term, have a look at its history and its origins, and how night walking was viewed in the Victorian period. We're also then going to consider the question of criminality and night walking. Again, that has a very long history, and we can think about the ways in which Stevenson is perhaps kind of tapping into that history. We're going to look at the role of the flâneur in the novella, and then thinking about the way that relates to walking around at night. The notion of the night time in Jekyll and Hyde and why that's absolutely key. And of course, all of this is very interesting, but it needs to be applied specifically to the text. So we're going to be looking at some specific extracts from the book too. However, before we fully launch into this, there's just two things that I want to mention very briefly. The first is a fantastic blog, and in fact, much of this video is indebted to some of the thinking in Mr. Hansen's English blog. It's well worth checking out. I'm going to put a link to the blog, specifically the blog post that I read and that partly inspired this video. I'm going to put a link to that in the description, and I strongly recommend firstly that you follow Mr. Hansen on Twitter, and secondly that you read not just that blog post but all of the blog posts, because like I say, they're all very, very interesting and well worth your time, not just simply the one on Jekyll and Hyde. And secondly, there's a fantastic book called Nightwalking. It's a nocturnal history of London by the writer Matthew Beaumont, and really it's a combination of the blog, Mr. Hansen's English blog, and the Nightwalking book that really got me thinking about the way in which the flâneur and nighttime interrelate and connect in this particular novella in such an interesting and rewarding way. So both of those two things I want to kind of almost thank, I suppose, because this video wouldn't have been possible without their thinking and without their writing. So let's move on. Well, what do we mean by night walking? This is taken directly from Matthew Beaumont's book, Nightwalking. And there's a couple of things that I want to point out about this. Let's look at that sense that night walking is extravagant, okay? Moving beyond bounds. I think that there's a sense in which you are, when you are walking at night, and certainly the characters who walk at night in Jekyll and Hyde, are moving beyond social boundaries, are operating outside of perhaps in some ways kind of conventional morality. Certainly the behaviour of Hyde seems to fit that. Notice as well the words covert and surreptitious. There's an enormous amount of covert and surreptitious activity, and in fact there's an enormous amount of activity that's ambiguous and unclear. Why is Kura walking around the streets so late at night? There's a lot of kind of unanswered questions in the book when it comes to night walking. And it's worth having that notion of night walking as extravagant, moving beyond bounds, operating beyond or outside of not just geographical bounds, but social, moral bounds, whatever that might be. And I think what's interesting in the book is that it's left rather ambiguous. So this is the definition that we're going to be using. We also need a bit of history of night walking. So for a very, very long period of time, night walking or common night walking, as it was known, was a specific criminal act, and you would be arrested and punished for being a common night walker. And it's only, as it says there, until the end of until 1827 that common night walking becomes lawful, or night walking itself becomes lawful. It's been a specific crime since 1285. One thing that's very interesting in the night walking book by Matthew Beaumont is the way in which Beaumont traces the different approach to night walking, or different attitudes from those in positions of authority to people walking around at night. What do I mean by that? Well, I mean that if you are wealthy, if you are perceived to be a person, as it says there, of good reputation, then you are able to walk around at night without fear of arrest. But if you are perceived to be, not a great lord, not a substantial person of good reputation, then walking around at night is actually quite a dangerous activity, in the sense that you're liable to be arrested and potentially imprisoned. So there is this close link to class reputation. So we might want to think about that a little bit, between, say, Kura walking around at night and Hyde walking around at night, and the different attitudes to their particular night walking. Now, of course, when Jekyll and Hyde is published, obviously night walking is a lawful activity, and in fact lots of people do it. Dickens very famously was very fond of walking around at night. However, think very carefully about the way in which, yes, the law can change, but social attitudes often lag some way behind. So there is still a sense, I think even today, that if you are walking around late at night, there's this sort of criminal air about that particular act. If we go back to the definition, that you are moving beyond bounds, or operating in that almost extravagant way, outside of the normal bounds of behaviour, by being, walking around nocturnally. So we're going to be applying some of this thinking around night walking, reputation and social class position. We're going to be applying that to a couple of extracts very soon. Which brings us neatly on to what do we mean by a flâneur. Now, it's quite a difficult term to define. It's also a rather ambiguous term. A huge set of very rich and interesting associations connected to it, though. So if we have a look at the origin of the word, okay, from the French noun flâneur, meaning someone who strolls, so a stroller, but also look at some of those other words: lounger, saunterer, loafer, that sense of relaxed idleness. It's not purposeful walking. A flâneur is one who saunters, who walks not necessarily with any kind of objective, but simply walks and observes, spectates. As it says, fantastic German philosopher Walter Benjamin says, they are an urban spectator. They are experiencing the spectacle of the modern city. But he also writes, and I think this is particularly pertinent for Jekyll and Hyde, notice that you've got that second part of the definition: an amateur detective and investigator of the city. Well, that's Utterson. Okay, so we can be thinking then, right, so are there ways in which Utterson may be considered a flâneur? Is Kura a flâneur, walking around at night, a connoisseur of the street, idly in his kind of wealthy position, walking around and enjoying the sights and the sounds of London at night? So that the flâneur then is simply a male, wealthy, idle, sauntering through the city at day or indeed at night, and enjoying it almost as if you were enjoying a meal, a kind of almost gastronomic experience, dining on the sights and the sounds of the city. So let's think about night time in Jekyll and Hyde. One of the things that students often pick up on is just how much of the book takes place at night time, which is of itself interesting. Now, I was curious as to how many references there were to night actually in the book itself, and you can go to a thing called a concordance that actually tracks the number of mentions of a particular word or phrase. So there are 32 references to night in Jekyll and Hyde, bearing in mind that Jekyll and Hyde is not a long book, okay, it's a relatively short novella. That's a lot of night time. So that then begs the question, well, why is that important? Why is this particular setting so crucial? And if we go back to that definition, nighttime is when people are, for various reasons, perhaps liberated or freed from the normal bounds that society imposes upon them. That they are freer to engage in extravagances of behaviour than they would be in the daytime. And for hopefully some fairly obvious reasons. So loads of characters in this book are walking around at night. Okay, Kura does it, Utterson does it, Hyde does it. Begs the question, why? Why are they doing this? Is it because the night affords them greater opportunity to, be a flâneur, to engage in that kind of, engage in the spectacle of the city? Or is it also an opportunity to move beyond the bounds of propriety and, normal moral behaviour to engage in rather more illicit and surreptitious acts? So let's have a look at this this very, very famous extract from the book. Okay, so we're going to pick out a number of different things. We're just going to run through it. Okay, obviously you can read it, but also quickly run through it too. From that time forward, Mr. Utterson began to haunt the door in the by-street of shops. In the morning before office hours, at noon when business was plenty and time scarce, at night under the face of the fogged city moon. By all lights and at all hours of solitude or concourse, the lawyer was to be found on his chosen post. If he be Mr. Hyde, he had thought, I shall be Mr. Seek. And at last his patience was rewarded. It was a fine dry night, frost in the air, the streets as clean as a ballroom floor, the lamps unshaken by any wind, drawing a regular pattern of light and shadow. By 10 o'clock, when the shops were closed, the by-street was very solitary, and in spite of the low growl of London from all round, very silent. Small sounds carried far. Domestic sounds out of the houses were clearly audible on either side of the roadway, and the rumour of the approach of any passenger preceded him by a long time. Mr. Utterson had been some minutes at his post, when he was aware of an odd light footstep drawing near. In the course of his nightly patrols he had long grown accustomed to the quaint effect with which the footfalls of a single person, while he is still a great way off, suddenly spring out distinct from the vast hum and clatter of the city. Yet his attention had never before been so sharply and decisively arrested, and it was with a strong, superstitious prevision of success that he withdrew into the entry of the court. The steps drew swiftly nearer, and swelled out suddenly louder as they turned the end of the street. The lawyer, looking forth from the entry, could soon see what manner of man he had to deal with. He was small and very plainly dressed, and the look of him, even at that distance, went somehow strongly against the watcher's inclination. But he made straight for the door, crossing the roadway to save time, and as he came, he drew a key from his pocket, like one approaching home. Okay, so this is Utterson staking out this mysterious door and hoping to have a good look at the rather unattractive, strange, deformed visage of a certain Mr. Hyde. What do we notice about this? Well, I think it's very interesting in two key areas. Firstly, Utterson the flâneur, okay, the detective, the amateur sleuth. Well, we know he's not a particularly good detective, okay, he's no Sherlock Holmes, but he is playing that role, the observer of human behaviour, and he takes a kind of interest in this door and in this strange character of Mr. Hyde. Okay, that's why he wants to become, as he says, Mr. Seek. But what I really enjoy about this particular extract is the way in which Stevenson constructs the sensory experience of nighttime in the city. So what do we notice? Well, the shops are closed. It's 10 o'clock. There's no one really around. The by-street's very solitary. London still, though, is threatening at night time. Notice that in spite of the low growl of London from all around, okay, growl with its connotations of kind of animal violence and so on, there's a sort of unsettling aspect to London at night, as is the silence, okay? And we get this sense that small sounds carry far. It wouldn't be like that today. It wouldn't be like that with, obviously electric street lighting, but also much busier. The modern city, far, far busier than London at this particular point in the 19th century. There's a sense in which London hasn't at night been fully kind of colonised by capitalist life. Okay, and you can hear the domestic sounds from the houses, and you can also hear the person approaching from far away, and so we get this odd, as it's described, quaint effect with which the footfalls of a single person are distinct from the hum and clatter of the city. London is threatening at night time here. It's odd. It is an unsettling experience. And what else do we notice about this? Okay, we also notice that Utterson makes pretty swift judgment about Hyde. He was small and very plainly dressed. So he sort of recognises that Hyde is of a lower social class, certainly, than himself. So beginning to think, well, if Utterson is the flâneur, who's this poor, potentially criminal element approaching? So all of the freedom of night walking, the freedom to be able to hide out and observe and watch and see who this Mr. Hyde. That's Utterson is really kind of enjoying that liberation, that extravagance. At the same time, Hyde is using nighttime to do as his name suggests, to hide, to obscure his presence. Okay. Notice as well that Hyde, when he's walking around, we're going to compare this to Kura shortly. Notice how Hyde is far more direct. Hyde's night walking is always with a clear objective. Hyde, therefore, is in many ways might consider him not a flâneur, but rather more criminal. He's got a clear objective, using the nighttime to hide and to obscure his presence. But he's always going somewhere. Okay, he made straight for the door. There's not the calm, relaxed, sauntering kind of idleness that you might get with the kind of typical image of a flâneur. Which brings us neatly on to this one. Okay, this next extract, taken from chapter 4, the Kura murder case. So lots going on here. We've got this interesting frame narrative. The maidservant is observing the action, and we're then being told this by the narrator. So we've got kind of very interesting framing going on. Nighttime again, unsettling, cloudless night we've got. Lit by the full moon. Interesting connections between lunacy, even the word lunacy and lunatic come from lunar, okay, and the connection between a full moon and madness, I think, is being played on by Stevenson there. And then let's start from it seems she was romantically given. So it seems she was romantically given, for she sat down upon her box, which stood immediately under the window, and fell into a dream of musing, already raising questions of the kind of reliability of this particular narrative. Makes it seem odd and dreamlike. Never, she used to say with streaming tears when she narrated that experience, never had she felt more at peace with all men, or thought more kindly of the world. And as she so sat, she became aware of an aged, beautiful gentleman with white hair drawing near along the lane, and advancing to meet him. So look at the way they move through the narrative, drawing near. So Kura draws near, whereas the other, Hyde, as we later find out, is advancing. Okay, if we quickly nip back, notice he made straight for the door. In this next extract, Hyde is advancing. It's all about a kind of directness with these particular characters. And advancing to meet him, another and very small gentleman to whom at first she paid less attention. She's more interested in the wealthier, clearly higher social class, beautiful gentleman with white hair, Kura. When they'd come within speech, which was just under the maid's eyes, the older man bowed and accosted the other with a very pretty manner of politeness. Lots to talk about there. One of the most interesting and ambiguous phrases in the whole book. It did not seem as if the subject of his address were of great importance. Indeed, from his pointing, it sometimes appeared as if he were only inquiring his way. But the moon shone on his face as he spoke, and the girl was pleased to watch it. It seemed to breathe such an innocent and old-world kindness of disposition, yet with something high too, as of a well-founded self-content. Presently her eye wandered to the other, and she was surprised to recognise in him a certain Mr. Hyde, who had once visited her master and for whom she had conceived a dislike. He had in his hand a heavy cane with which he was trifling, but he answered never a word, and seemed to listen with an ill-contained impatience. Notice breaking out of bounds. And then all of a sudden he broke out in a great flame of anger, stamping with his foot, brandishing the cane, and carrying on, as the maid described it, like a madman. A nice little connection back to the full moon earlier. The old gentleman took a step back, and with the air of one very much surprised and a trifle hurt. And at that Mr. Hyde broke out of all bounds. Again, back to this notion of night-time and extravagance. Breaking out of bounds clubbed him to the earth. And next moment, with ape-like fury, he was trampling his victim underfoot and hailing down a storm of blows, under which the bones were audibly shattered, and the body jumped upon the roadway. At the horror of these sights and sounds, the maid fainted. Of course you would, okay? Seeing something so awful. So, lots of breaking out of bounds here. Lots of, to use that word again, extravagance, okay? But what else have we got? Well, I think here, a great way of thinking about this interaction is we've got two night walkers. But we've got two very different night walkers coming into contact with one another. We've got Kura, the night walking flâneur. Okay, so notice the way that he actually is described as moving. He just draws near along the lane. That's all we hear about that. We don't particularly get a sense of the sort of intense directness and purposeful walking that we get with Hyde. It did not seem as if the subject of his address were of great importance. So what he's doing, he's not particularly direct or seemingly all that important. He's just moving through the city at night. What Kura is up to is open for debate and question, and it's never made clear in the book. On the other hand, notice how Hyde moves, advancing to meet him. This kind of directness, the word advancing, with almost kind of military set of connotations, more aggressive, more direct, more purposeful than Kura. So if Kura is the night walking flâneur, then perhaps we could consider Hyde as the night walking criminal. And we've got this clash, this conflict, this coming together of these two versions of the night walker. And of course, Hyde is the night walking criminal. He's the absolute epitome of the night walking criminal, the night walking criminal murderer, using the cover of night to engage in some unbelievably violent, animalistic, ape-like behaviour. All right, so it's an interesting way of thinking about this meeting. Interesting way of considering Kura and Hyde and this very famous moment from the novella. How can we then bring this into our wider thinking, and what should we be thinking about next? Okay, so just as a quick summary, Kura, is he a night walking flâneur? It seems to be. Okay, notice that he seems unhurried, the calm, relaxed spectator. But then we have that word accost. Now the word accost has all sorts of resonances and meanings, and has a long connection with people procuring prostitutes and so on. It's not made clear. And in fact, actually, there is a sort of ambiguous duality to Kura himself. The unhurried, respectable, high social position flâneur, and yet accosting someone in the street. He has that possible criminal aspect to him too. On the other hand, Hyde, very much the night-walking criminal, that purposeful, direct, advancing, moving through the city, clearly going somewhere. Okay, notice as well how extravagant his behaviour is, that breaking out of all bounds, using night as an opportunity to engage in that kind of boundary breaking behaviour. So, a couple of questions to consider that are worth thinking about to enrich and develop your thinking of the around the novella. So, firstly, why is walking at night so important? Who walks at night? What key moments in the book are set at night time? Why might that be? Why is Hyde going on these nocturnal walks? What about Utterson's nocturnal walks? What about Carew and Enfield and their nocturnal walking? What about Utterson as the as a flâneur? His desire to investigate and engage in detective work, even though of course he's a lawyer. The notion of observing the city, the kind of walks that he goes on, that we hear particularly at the beginning of the book, those walks with Enfield, this pair of flâneurs moving through the city, observing and spectating. And then finally, how can it enrich our understanding of the novella? London is changing. Obviously, towards the end of the 19th century, we're getting much more electric lighting. I think the first street in Brixton, the aptly named Electric Avenue, gets electric lighting in 1880. Okay, but there's still lots of London that is lit by gas lamps. But that is gradually changing. So, but there are still plenty of bits of London that are going to be very dark, unsettling, murky places. Okay, that changes over the course as we move into the 20th century, and obviously how illuminated and bright London is in 2020. Think about that. Think about the atmosphere and how different that would be at the in the sort of mid to late 19th century. And then also think about that ambiguity and duality of night walking itself. In some ways still considered a criminal activity, a criminal act. If you're walking around late at night, you're probably doing something you shouldn't. But we've got this shift into the direction of the flâneur, the person who walks through the city, spectates, observes, saunters their way through, and indeed does so at night. And as I've said, in the book Nightwalking, there's an entire section of the book devoted to Dickens's night walking and how fond he was of walking around the streets of London at night, and how important that was to him, both in terms of his creative process, but also in terms of his exploration and understanding of the city itself. So there's lots to think about here, lots to reflect on, lots of interesting ambiguities and questions. I would also, definitely bears repeating, plug the blog that I mentioned, and the link to that blog will be in the description below, and also that Matthew Beaumont book, Nightwalking. If you're interested in the history of London at night over the course of about 1,000 years or so, then the book is well worth reading, and I think there is actually a sale on at Verso at the moment, so you can pick it up for not a huge amount of money, and it's definitely well worth your time. So I hope today's video has given you a bit of food for thought, some things to reflect on, to consider, to build and enrich your understanding of this phenomenally interesting and rewarding and strange little novella. Thanks for watching. See you next time.